We're talking about finance teams, but from not from the standpoint of technology, but from the standpoint of people. And very few of these podcasts are talking about the people. So that's what we're going to do today. And I'd like to introduce my guest, Honors Leo Lindberg. How did I do on that?
Yeah, thanks for the effort, April. I could see that you were giving it your best, and that was really, really well. So thanks a
Yeah,
lot.
now you say it so we can hear how you really say it.
Also, I'll say it in a Danish accent. In Denmark, you would say Anders Liv Lindberg.
Very good. Okay, that was way better.
Well, I
Um,
mean, from an US
right, you're
context,
native.
very
Yeah,
well.
of course, of
Yeah.
course. So Honors is from Business Partnering Institute. And so what I thought I would do is just get started and explain what I understand about what your company does. And so as we're talking about talent teams, that basically you have a management consulting firm for lack of a better term, and you're tech agnostic, but basically what you do is specifically go in and train finance teams on hard skills as well as soft skills so that they can up level and upgrade what they do as a team. So tell me what I got wrong. Tell me, or fill in the blanks about what you do.
Yeah, I don't think you got anything wrong, April. This is kind of what we are born out of, being a learning and development company, where let's say most of the learning and development programs that we have run are more on the soft skills part, but there are also hard skills in terms of problem solving, for instance, or business model drivers and so on. But it's really, if you look at the finance area, it's the soft skills where finance professionals are really struggling. And of course, with technology taking over more and more the hard part of it, it's really those people skills, soft skills that makes the difference. And I just recorded a podcast earlier today, and it's around communication. Because everything in life and careers boil down to moments of communication. And finance professionals, they have really been challenged throughout the ages with communication, right? So it's just an example of some of the skills that we train, but we also do project consulting. So we go out and work with the finance operating model in companies and change it, transform it, and so on. And then we also do interim short-term contract work where we actually work as finance practitioners ourselves. Or it could be work in the finance transformation team of a bigger company where maybe we do the PMO or something like that. And we also have some change management consultants that are of course working on learning development programs, but could also work on some of these assignments directly with companies.
Thank you. So when you talk to finance leaders, you speak about the soft skills. What is one of the soft skills that you hear most often finance leaders lack in their teams? What do they come to you with?
I think the most popular kind of single module of our learning programs is probably the communication piece.
Okay.
Uh, and why is that? Well, it's because the monthly finance cycle. You produce the numbers, and then you do some management reporting, and then you go have that monthly meeting, right? That really important meeting where you discuss how are we doing. And a lot of finance teams, they have let's say page one is kind of the table of content. Then page two is maybe an executive summary that says, this account is up and this account is down. And then page three is the giant table with numbers and variances and whatnot. And that form of communication just doesn't work if you're not communicating to the finance professionals, at least, because they are not seeing numbers in the same way. Even let's say if you're communicating to, for instance, engineers who are also numbers people, they would still see something different. So we're not tailoring the communication to our audience. We're communicating the way we like to communicate, which works well if you're communicating to a peer, but not to someone outside of finance. And that's really what we need to help them do, because they work so really, really hard on the analysis, the reporting, and whatnot, and then it just all kind of falls on the finish line, and that's a real shame. And I want people to succeed on that.
Yeah, so what do you do? Walk me through that process of helping to train a finance person to speak in ways that make sense to, let's say, the CFO or the leadership, the CEO. What do you do to get them to understand how to communicate differently?
Yeah, so I think in simple terms, what we do is we give them structure. We give them a different structure of how to communicate. It kind of has the 5 steps. So the first step is, let's say, the financial summary, stating the situation, where are we, as a company, so that we all have a common understanding of this. This is where we stand. Just so there are no two ways around that. Let's say you have half an hour, you may be spending 5 minutes here max. Then step two is, what are the key attention points that we need to be discussing in this meeting here? Things that are, not going the way we expected it to, or opportunities that have appeared that we didn't, take into account. Where should we really focus as a management team? That's kind of step number two. And, depending on the situation, you spend more or less time here. Step number three is recommend some sort of action to move things forward. Right. And, a lot of finance professionals, they struggle with leaning out and making that recommendation. They're like, I can share you the facts and some deep dives, but you need to figure out what you want to do. And we basically say, lean out a little bit. It doesn't mean they will say yes to your recommendation or they will just do whatever you want them to do. But you need to say, basis what I have learned from my analysis and from talking to a lot of people probably, here's what we see and here's what we think we should do. If that then leads to a discussion and we decide on that, or we decide on something differently, that's okay. But we need to lean out and kind of be part of that. Step number four, you don't necessarily have that in your main presentation. You don't necessarily cover that in depth, but that's your arguments for your recommendation and the facts kind of underlying those arguments. So why is this a good idea? Why are you recommending this? Because there might be questions when you come with a recommendation, so you should be able to back it up. And that's kind of what you do in step number four. Step number five is then, whether it's the most important or not, you can always discuss, but it's the call to action. So, okay, we've put forward the recommendation, we've had lots of discussions, but what are we actually going to do? What are we going to do from this meeting here? What do we agree on? Who's taking action? By when? And what outcome do we expect from it? Because having that clear and agreed call to action gives you the mandate to follow up. Say, a week later, okay, did you actually, start that initiative, or did you talk to those 3 people about changing how they're doing things and so on? And let's say, yes, yeah, we did that. Okay, how did it go? Did it work, or we did something differently, right? So you're inserting yourself into the business operation of the company rather than just being that person that comes once a month and sharing the financials. So doing those 5 steps will significantly transform the financial communication of, I'd say 95% of finance.
Yeah, that's a lot. That's a lot more leadership than what you would normally receive from your finance professional. I really like that.
Yeah.
And my question then is, do you ever have finance professionals that struggle with step 4, like they're so used to aggregating that they're not accustomed to thinking about those recommendations, like where you have to train them on how to even come up with the story and the recommendations in the first place?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's hard, of course, right? Because you're not used to leaning out. And that's, of course, where, let's say, the more classic consulting toolbox like problem solving comes into play, right? Because you're like, okay, I can do analysis, I can figure out where we have issues, but going from that to actually having a recommended solution, that's a big space, right? How do I do that? Well, then, of course, there's many different kind of problem solving frameworks. And we use the one from McKinsey's 7-step problem solving model, where the communication piece comes at the end, but then there's kind of like, framing the issue, creating an issue tree, doing some analysis, having a work plan for how you want to test things, and then you come up with a recommendation, right? You probably won't necessarily use the problem solving toolbox every month on every single problem, but you will use elements of it. And, if you combine that with the structure for communication, you get a really impactful finance professional.
Got it. So you have models for training. Again, the communication is perhaps the thing that you hear most often from finance leaders, but underneath that communication piece, then there are these other layers. So for example, in order to communicate, we need problem solving skills. In order to, problem solve, we need to start thinking outside the box. And so you've got trainings for all of those things.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, we have a capability model of the capabilities that we believe finance professionals needs to have on top of their functional expertise, right? So you have your finance expertise, maybe you have a CPA or whatever it might be, and then you say, okay, well, I know my numbers to the T, but I don't know how to communicate them. I don't know how to make an impact, and that means I'm not part of the business. And that's frustrating. Okay, well, then let's build that skill set you need on top. because that's gonna what's gonna make you impactful. That's gonna make you feel excited about having an impact in the company. And that's, by the end of the day, that's what most people want, right? We
Absolutely.
don't necessarily just want to lean back and receive a paycheck. We actually want to have an impact on the things that are going on. That's kind of what we drive them towards.
Yeah, I love that because the other thing too is that, one of the problems that many finance teams have is turnover and burnout. And so I can see ways that when you feel like you feel like you actually are having an impact on the company, why you would, how that would prevent burnout and turnover and things like that, which is super meaningful when it comes to the bottom line. So that leads me to my next question, which is, what are some of the results that you've seen? Have you worked with companies long enough to where you've seen, again, there's the short-term results, but the long-term results over time, and what are some of those results that finance teams experience?
Yeah, so obviously what you want to drive towards is a cultural change where you simply work differently, where you may have the toolbox and it may be, elaborate from time to time, but it's just part of the DNA, part of how companies work. But it typically takes, 3, 4, 5 years to get to that point. And we also have steps that companies need to take to get there, right? Which is to establish the foundation. How do we want to do, business partnering, value-added finance in our company? How do we make that concrete with tools and capability models and whatnot? And then step three is kind of making that live in the organization to train people to recruit differently, right? Because whether you need to recruit an accountant or someone that's, a very dynamic relationship building person, I'm sure you can relate to that, April. It's just two different processes you need to run, different questions you need to ask. Maybe one needs to have a case and the other one needs to have a reconciliation. I don't know, right? I don't want
Yeah.
to say an accountant is worse than a business partner, because they're all really crucial elements of finance. But it's just, if you don't change, for instance, your ways of recruitment, you're just going to get the same people that you were starting with. And then that puts you behind the curve all the time. So it's recruitment, it's onboarding, it's performance dialogues where, let's say you have one-on-one with a leader and you are pushing towards business partnering. Well, then maybe you talk about, okay, so that, challenge they had in the business where you try to help out, how did that go? Did we solve it? Did it create some value? Versus if you're not having a focus on business partnering, you may be saying, hey, that month-end report, did it go out on time? I'm not saying the report should not go out on time, but it's not really the most critical part of creating the impact in the company. So it does take a long time to really get there. And we, let's say, mostly then do the training part, right, and then it kind of needs to be embedded and live inside the companies. We work with big companies where this is really the way of working. But then, like you say yourself, turnover as well, or a big Danish pharma company, they've grown so fast and they've hired so many people that even though they were pretty good before, then they again start a little bit behind the curve because so many people coming in. So it's just a very dynamic world that we live in, where obviously these days, right, but a lot of change in companies, a lot of change in finance functions as well. So it's hard to get to that end state, if there's ever such
Sure.
an end state, where it's just a high performing business partnering culture.
Yeah, that makes sense. So you guys actually have processes, I mean, it sounds like you've got things that will handle all of these different aspects. So performance management, recruitment, trainings for all these things, but that process might take years. Like we're not talking months. We're going to make this stick for the long haul. And so you'll be working with companies for several years as opposed to several months. Is that what I'm
Yeah,
hearing?
I would say that. And I can use my own personal story, right? So in terms of business partnering, I first heard about that in 2010, but it was only in 2019, my last role in corporate, where I could confidently say, now I got it. Now I really know how to do this successfully. And I could go into any company today without any background or industry knowledge, anything, and do good business partnering in 3 weeks or less, simply because of the approach that you take, the structures that you use, and of course the interpersonal skills that have been built on over those 10, 15 years, because they weren't innate from the beginning.
Right.
I could do that, right? So if it for an individual takes that 10 years, hopefully with everything we've done now, we can bring that to a shorter time, maybe two to
Sure.
4 years. That's an individual. Then think about the whole finance organization in a company. It simply just takes time, right? And of course, companies they sometimes just need that boost where they say, okay, let's just get 50 people trained. The learning journey can be 6 to 9 months. So you're here for a year or two cohorts, and then we'll try to take it from there, right? So it's rare that, let's say, we work for a company for like 5, 6, 7 years, also because it's such a volatile world we live in. So their priorities may also
Sure.
change.
Sure, but 2 to 4 years would be a typical timeline. So
I would say so.
quantitatively, these leaders that you started working with and said, "Hey, my team has trouble with communication." After you've been working with a team for, let's say, a year, 2 years, what's some of the qualitative feedback that you hear from these finance leaders after they've gone through some of this training?
Yeah. So it's not that we don't care about what the finance leaders say, but we more care about what the business leaders say, right?
Okay. Oh
So
yeah, that's a
can
great
the,
point.
can the business leaders actually observe a difference in their behavior? Can they say, well, actually, I've seen something that I never thought finance could do before? If we because we try to measure the impact of, for instance, learning programs that we do, right? uh, we use this Kirkpatrick model, which is very much within the HR learning space, has 4 levels of impact. The first is kind of like, participants like the module or the training,
Sure.
training course went on. The second one is, could they actually answer a few questions about the last module, about the training journal, like kind of like a quiz. And then the third layer is kind of that behavioral layer where you can only observe it. So we're not out there observing all the people, for instance, going for a training program, but we would then ask probably the most direct business stakeholder that they work with, as well as themselves and as well as their leader, and say, do you actually observe a different behavior? And we would even go so far as to use kind of a customer service approach and say, you know, would you be willing to recommend your finance professional, your finance
Mm,
business partner to another business leader? Scale 1 to 10.
okay.
And you need to get a 9 or 10 to get a positive score in that,
Wow.
whereas 7 to 8 is neutral and 1 to 6 is negative. So it's a high requirement to actually being promoted, let's say, by your business leader. But at
Right.
the end of the day, if they're not satisfied with the support they're getting from you, then you're not making an impact, because finance is not out
Right.
there, making revenue
Yeah.
and saving costs, whatever. That's business operations, but we need to enable them to do that even better. So the times where it's really been very successful for me, of course, I could say myself if I think it's successful, but it's when I've heard statements, quotes like, wow, I never thought finance could do that. Or, hey, Anders, we won turnaround product of the year. We could never have done it without you. Hey, Anders, we defended against this major competition play and we didn't lose as much money as we thought. You were a big part of it. Those kind of examples, and I always get goosebumps when I talk about it, because that's impact, not what I say, but what the customers say, right? And you want happy customers, both as a company but also as a finance professional.
Yeah, I love how you frame that. And so then as a finance professional, you see your business partners as clients. And so talking about it from a customer service standpoint is really smart, because then it changes your view of who you are as a finance person.
Yeah, essentially we say go from being finance centric to being customer centric. And what could a finance centric person could say, you need to deliver on this time in order for me to meet my deadlines.
Yeah.
Whereas a customer centric person would say, what can I do to help you be successful? Or how can I make it easy for you to, fill out a form or whatever it may be that I actually need to do my work, right? So that you're really much going on their playing field and saying, in simple terms, I am only here to help you be successful.
Yeah,
It's
that's
the only reason I'm here, right? And that's not common for people to have that approach.
I love that. And so that's so quantitatively, you talk about, let's say we won out against that competitor, or, whatever that might be. Um, do you do you measure revenue? Like, can this have an impact on on revenue for these companies that you work with?
Absolutely. It can have an impact. Of course, it's not necessarily for us to measure our direct impact, but it's to measure the impact through, for instance, participants in a learning program, right? And the way to do that is then the fourth level of this Kirkpatrick measure, which is kind of a very much result outcome. So what differences can you actually see in the business? And the way we do it is in part of the learning programs, participants will solve a case because we train them on problem solving. And that case is not something we have picked or something general. It's something they pick from their daily work, which can actually make a difference. So they will use the methodology, solve the case, present it to a management team, and get approval, start to implement it, and then realize some sort of value creation from that. And that's just solving one case. Then this should be the new way of working. So you continuously solve different challenges in the business, facilitating, involving, sometimes executing, right? But that the point is not necessarily to measure finance direct impact and kind of market that towards the business, but it's more to be able to talk about, okay, so you were part of solving this particular business problem. What was your role in it? Was it kind of leaning back and taking notes and sending out summaries, or were you up there in front of the screen facilitating, helping people to understand what to do? Two very different roles, but also two roles you could easily see finance professionals play. So if you cannot kind of articulate what your role was and what was the impact of the project in general, then it's like you didn't really make that impact, right? So you need to be super crisp on what your role was and storytelling that impact, not to the business, but to your finance colleagues, right? Because they need to see you doing it to strengthen their confidence that they can do it. So we need many role models in finance that are doing business partnering and are able to talk about it, storytell about it, to showcase the way forward. And to be honest, that's why I started my journey many years ago, sharing my thoughts on how finance could be more impactful, right? Because I didn't see any finance professionals share about those journeys. They were talking about accounting rules and IFRS standards, whatever it might be. They were not talking about how is finance making a difference, creating an impact. And I thought, let me share my story, even though it wasn't necessarily the greatest story in the world or the most impactful. But let's start talk about this to storytell what it is that we do that actually makes a difference.
That makes sense. So when it comes to revenue, you're then teaching finance professionals how to share their story and their impact, both qualitatively, quantitatively, so that then it creates, again, this culture that you're looking for of impact. And so then those who understand how to do it give confidence to those who are learning how to do it, and you get to then sustain. Then it becomes sustainable, right? This culture of
Yeah.
impact becomes sustainable.
Yeah.
So if somebody is hearing this and likes what they're hearing, how, first of all, I'm US based. I know you are working a lot with companies that are local to you in Copenhagen, but do you work with US based or other international companies as well?
Yeah, so we do work with companies internationally, of course, mostly within our own time zone. So we have a lot of Scandinavian based clients, but we've had clients from China, Vietnam, to Mexico and the US. So we've had clients all over the world, but mostly, of course, centered to where we are. So we're all kind of physically based here in Copenhagen.
I'm a big believer that when you invest in something like this, it can be challenging probably because, you're investing a lot, not only from a time standpoint, but also from a monetary standpoint, but that something like this, in essence, pays for itself. So in the impact that you see in revenue, that the service not only pays for itself, but then gives you even greater returns over time. And so again, that's kind of more like my thing is like when you hire someone, like your company or like my company, that the service should really pay for itself, maybe not immediately, but over time. Have you seen that that is the case?
Yeah, so what we try to do is um, kind of look at it as the cases that the participants solve as part of the program. There's going to be a value ticket to that. Now, of
Yeah,
course, we don't always track it all the way through to impact, and then maybe it's not all proof or not. But let's say there's a value ticket attached to that. We then say, okay, the sum of the value tickets is essentially the value that the training program, just from solving that one case, is actually giving.
right.
And usually that return on investment is 10 to 50x the investment in the training program. So
Yeah,
even if everything doesn't get implemented, typically if just one case gets implemented, you already have your return on investment there. And if they
got
can
it.
just use that as a new way of working, yeah, you can see the impact being multiplied, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And so if someone does want to learn more about your company and what you do and talk about using your services, how do they get a hold of you?
Yeah, no, of course, they can always go to our homepage, which is bpidk.org. But usually people can also find me on LinkedIn. As you also know, April,
Yes.
I'm always kind of available there. We also share content every single day on how to drive forward, either as an individual finance professional or if you are a senior finance leader, CFO, also perspectives on how to do that. So, definitely go and give a follow on LinkedIn. And if you have a need for solving some of the challenges that we talk about, then of course you can always reach out.
Yep, perfect. So now I want to end with a question that's a little bit more personal. What's something that someone wouldn't know about you until they really get to know you?
So it's funny because obviously I've worked with lots of different people over the years. So I once worked with an HR business partner. She was HR business partnering to the finance organization, and I was kind of, doing some transformational work with that same finance organization. And then at one point she was leaving the role to do something else, and we sat down to have a coffee and kind of just concluded on everything that had happened and so on. And she
Mhm.
said, "You know what, Anders? I thought you were a cold prick when I first met you, but actually you're a really nice and funny guy to get to know and so on, right? So sometimes I guess I can come across a bit maybe too professional and not caring so much about people, but actually I do care a lot about that, and I guess I wouldn't have founded a people-centric consulting company if I didn't.
Sure.
But yeah, get to know me. I'm not a cold prick. That's for that.
That's funny. That's awesome. Well, I can tell like when you get passionate about something, like, your hands start to move and you get really excited about it. So I can tell at least that you really do love what you do and that impact that it creates for those around you. So is there anything that we failed to mention that you think is really important for finance leaders to understand before we sign off?
Maybe just this, you know, becoming value adding and making that impact. It's easy to explain in an interview like this. It's easy to maybe put on a slide and so on, but it's hard to do, right? So
Mm,
I think we shouldn't be too hard on ourselves for not necessarily knocking it out of the park in the first or the second go. As long as we can see micro steps towards that goal of actually being that value adding business partner, I think it's okay, right? Because
yeah.
it is really, really hard. We're numbers people at heart. We're not people, but we need to become more people, and it's a journey. So I guess the simple statement is don't be too hard on yourself.
I love that. Yeah, that's great advice. Well, thank you for your time. It's been wonderful. I've learned a ton, and that's my favorite thing about these interviews is how much I learn personally and how unique your business is and your business model. And I can see how impactful it would be to have you guys working with the finance team and with a company.